Oh, all right. Yeah, I live on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. So, Bishkek American Centers welcome you, dear friends, and hope doing great and well this snowy day today. And we are happy to have this virtual meeting dedicated Martin Luther King Day with special guest, special speaker, U.S. Embassy representative Heather Latina. Heather, how are you doing today?
I am doing well and loving the snow as well. Thank you for having me, Mahaba. I appreciate it.
Mhm. So, dear friends, thank you for joining us today. And please feel free asking your question during the presentation and participate in our meeting. So, Heather, I'm giving you a floor.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It might take me a second to get the presentation up. So give me just a moment. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you can see on the screen, the topic of today's presentation is dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. And we in the United States celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day on the third Monday in January. And we take that time to reflect on the work that remains to be done to achieve racial equity, especially in the United States. This holiday is a holiday to honor Martin Luther King, who was a civil rights activist during the 1950s and the 1960s. So let's pause for a second and define and talk about civil rights and what activism or an activist is or does. Civil rights are important rights that we consider to be essential to democracy and freedom. They're rights that create equal opportunities and protections under the law, regardless of someone's race, their religion, or other characteristics. Does anyone have ideas or thoughts about examples of civil rights? And if you do, feel free to drop those in the chat. And as you're doing that, contrast civil rights with a related idea, but that's slightly different, which is civil liberties. Civil liberties, in contrast to civil rights, are freedoms that we have because the government is restrained or prohibited from doing something. For example, the freedom of speech, where the government is prohibited from stopping people from saying certain things. Unlike civil liberties, civil rights are things that are created by law, created by government action to protect people. Some examples that come to mind for me are the right to vote or the civil right to a fair trial, the right to government services, for example, public education. Those are some of the important civil rights that Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for. An activist is a person who fights for political or social change. And activism can take the form of many different things. It can be in the form of writing letters to a government representative or meeting with a government representative. Some people give speeches. It's one of the things that Martin Luther King is famous for. It can be sharing information, using social media, organizing people to protest or to boycott something. And to boycott means to not use something that you would otherwise use. Can you think of any ideas of modern day civil rights activists? I want to share with you a couple teen activists from the United States that would be what I would consider to be good examples of modern day activists. And I suspect that both of these young women probably viewed Martin Luther King Jr. as a role model for the work that they've been doing. On the right, you see a picture of Mari Kopeny. At age 13, Mari established herself as a young activist. It was during the Flint, Michigan water crisis. Flint, Michigan is a city in the United States, and in 2016, it was discovered that the water in Flint, Michigan was not safe to drink. Mari wrote a letter to the president, at the time that was President Barack Obama, to raise awareness about the issue that was impacting her community. This resulted in the president visiting her community and issuing a declaration that her community was in a state of emergency. In 2018, she partnered with an organization to raise over 50,000 US dollars to donate bottled water to people who lived in Flint, Michigan. And today, Mari is one of the youngest delegates or representatives to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. On the right, you see a picture of Marley Diaz, and she founded a movement called 1,000 Black Girl Books. This movement had the aim of collecting and donating books about Black females. And Marley did this after she realized that the only literature and books that were being covered in her classes were about white boys. She was recognized by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential teens of 2015. And she even spoke at the White House in the United States for a summit on women. She continues to advocate for Black representation and self-empowerment. And in fact, she wrote the book that she's holding in her hands called Marley Diaz Gets It Done, and So Can You. She uses social media, Instagram and Twitter, for her activism. And she has even used those platforms to interview famous women. In fact, she interviewed Michelle Obama, the wife of the former president. So looking at the role model who may have inspired these young teens, let's learn a little bit more about him. Martin Luther King was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. Georgia is a state in the southern part of the United States in the southeast. And he was a minister and a social rights activist in the 1950s and 60s. He was the leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. He participated in and led marches to make sure that Black people had the right to vote, that they had the same labor rights as other people, and that they also had other basic civil rights the same way that white people did. For example, the right to go to the same places and use the same things as white people. He worked on an issue called desegregation. Segregation is a word in English that means to keep things separate. And before the 1950s and 1960s, there were laws and rules that kept Black people separate from white people in certain spaces. For example, Martin Luther King led a bus boycott. Remember, the word boycott means to not use something. So a bus boycott would be a movement not to use the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And he did that in 1955. What prompted him to do that was that Black people were being arrested for not giving up their seats to white people. The rules were forcing them to ride in the back of the bus. He organized Black people so that they would stop riding the buses. And that boycott lasted over 1 year. It actually ended when a court said that buses could not require people to sit in certain places based on the color of their skin. Some facts about Martin Luther King that I think are really interesting are that he started college at age 15. In the United States, that is very young to go to college. Most college students, when they start, are 18 or 19 years old. He went to the same school that his father and his grandfather had attended, and he studied sociology. After he graduated from college, he went on to go to school for graduate school at Boston University. And that's where he received a doctorate in theology. Theology is the study of religion. And this is interesting because Martin Luther King gave a very famous speech that we'll talk about in a moment. And one of the reasons that people think he was such a good speaker was because of his training in religion or theology and his ability to speak to people. I also think it's fascinating that he was arrested 29 times. He went to jail for acts of civil disobedience, not following the law. He was also the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize when it was awarded to him in 1964. He was a remarkable man. It was in 1964 that the civil rights movement in the United States achieved two of its greatest successes, and those were largely due to his work. One was that the United States adopted the 24th Amendment, and that was a law that abolished what was called a poll tax, or essentially a fee or a cost for people to vote. That made it difficult for Black people to vote in elections. The other victory or success that was achieved that year was the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibited discriminating on the basis of race in employment or in education. It also outlawed racial segregation, or the separation of people based on race, in public facilities, such as bathrooms. It was in October of 1964, that same year, that King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize came with a cash award, or cash prize, of over 54,000 US dollars. And he donated all of that money to the civil rights movement. On the screen, you'll see 4 of the primary peaceful protests, meaning nonviolent protests, that were led by Martin Luther King. He was a symbol of nonviolent protests in the United States. The first one we already talked about briefly, which was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which was a protest campaign against racial segregation in the public transit system in Montgomery, Alabama, meaning like the public bus system. The second one, the Albany Movement, was his organization of a group of activists who were protesting the city's segregation policies. The Birmingham campaign lasted 2 months in 1963, and it was an effort to end discriminatory economic policies. For example, some of the protests were against businesses that hired only white people or that had separate restrooms for Black and white people. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders organized other marches from Selma, Alabama, to the state capital of Alabama in Montgomery to fight for voting rights for everyone. And the last one that's listed on the screen was one of the largest political rallies that was ever seen in the United States, the March on Washington. That march brought between 200 and 300,000 people to Washington, D.C. And those were the people that Dr. King delivered his famous speech to, called I Have a Dream. And that speech was delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It's interesting that over 200,000 people showed up because the organizers had only hoped and expected that 100,000 people would come. Some things that I find to be really interesting about the speech is that it was one of the things that impressed government leaders and helped change the laws related to civil rights. It led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that we talked about earlier, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Also, there were other speakers. It wasn't just Dr. King who was speaking. There was a white labor rights leader who spoke, and a rabbi, which is a Jewish religious leader. All of the speakers were encouraging Americans not to watch silently as people in their community were discriminated against, but to take action. And the final thing that I think is really interesting about his speech, the speech is titled, I Have a Dream. But his advisors, the people who were giving him advice, told him not to keep using the phrase, I have a dream. He had used it in many speeches before, and they thought that he should change his language and use different wording to speak to the people who were coming to see him. But right before he was talking, he was having a conversation with a gospel singer, and she said, make sure you tell them about the dream. And she convinced him to abandon what he had written for his speech and to instead improvise, which means to talk without a written speech. And that speech that he gave without notes is now one of the most famous and widely celebrated speeches in the United States history. Let's try to listen to part of it now.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discourse of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day with all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, my country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
So thank you for listening to that. I want to take a moment to share with you like some of the lines from that speech. Just hang on for 1 second, I think. Here we go. My apologies. Some technical glitches.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you for such an impressive and legendary video. It's true legendary video. So
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna get back here to the slideshow. Hopefully, there we go. I think we're back on track. So I wanted to take just a moment to take some of the lines from that speech, because I know it can be, at least for me, it can be hard to like listen to it and hear all of the words and to think about like why it was so powerful for many Americans. And so I want to take a second and think about this phrase, I have a dream. In the first quote that I pulled from the speech is, I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. And one of the things that people think was so powerful about Martin Luther King's speech was that he was inspiring hope. It was about how people have the ability to change the world, and that he had this dream. And even though there were difficulties and it wasn't always easy, that it was something that could be done. And he really inspired people with this message of hope. The other thing about his speech that is so incredible is that he used language to really create a picture in your mind. Like when I listen to this speech, I'm seeing pictures in my mind of what's happening and what he's describing. So, for example, I have a dream that one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. And when you hear him say these words, you see in your mind children of all colors, religions coming together, holding hands, and treating each other as equals and sisters and brothers. Another way that he uses visualization is, or like creating pictures, is describing landscape. So the third quote, we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And you can kind of feel the momentum of justice building or righteousness building like a river, that has this power to flow and change a landscape. In the very last one, and I think it's cut off a little bit for you guys, but the very last quote on this page, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That quote at the very end, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, is a quote from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And so throughout his speech, you see places where he is looking to other really important documents in the United States to use that language to explain the values that he is trying to impart. But he's like drawing connections back to the Bible, which is a religious document. He's drawing connections back to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, things that many of the people who were listening to him would have read. And those words like hold special meaning for them. And he beautifully incorporated that into his speech. I would encourage all of you to just take a moment to think about which of these quotes on this page might be your favorite, and to think about why it is that these lines from his speech are interesting, unique, or powerful. And if you want to, feel free to share those in the chat. And if you have other favorite quotes from his speech, please feel free to share those instead and why you think that they are powerful and important. I want to switch for a moment and just talk about how Martin Luther King Day is celebrated today in the United States. We celebrate it on the third Monday in January, and most people have the day off from work. And it's the only federal holiday that is designated or kind of set aside to be a national day of service. And that is to encourage all people in the United States to volunteer to improve their communities. So some people take that day to help distribute food to people who are hungry or can't afford to buy food, to maybe clean up their parks, or to do other things to help their communities. Some people instead attend marches or parades or speeches that are being given by current day civil rights and political leaders. I myself like to celebrate it by going back and revisiting the words of Martin Luther King's speech, listening to him speak, and of remembering the power that people have to change the world. And as we wrap up the slideshow, I want to encourage all of you to think about, and maybe we can talk about, what people in the Kyrgyz Republic have had an impact on your country, the laws, or your culture. And I would love to hear from you and have you share if there are people that you can think of, who those are, and whether your country has special holidays to celebrate any of your national heroes. I'm going to stop sharing, and then we can hopefully take questions if you have any.
Yeah. So Heather, thank you for a great presentation. It was really informative, and the video, it was just powerful. So we received the question, and so let me show and ask you.
Thanks for coming. I knew
Hello, Heather. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And here the question from my brain. Hello, thank you for great presentation. I would like to know about main parade. Is there a special city or place where this holiday is celebrated officially?
That's a great question. I don't think that there's one city or place in the United States that's specially designated to celebrate it. Before moving to Kyrgyzstan, I lived outside of Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. is definitely one of the places that has special events to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King. But before that, I lived in Montana, and even there we had, special celebrations to honor this particular civil rights leader. And so it is something that is celebrated across the country. Bigger events, happen, I think, more in the bigger cities. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question is, dear Heather, here's my question for you. Martin Luther Day is a national or federal holiday, and what the difference between this type of holiday? Thank you a lot in advance.
Also a great question. So a national holiday or a federal holiday in the United States means that the government of the entire country has made a decision that that day will be celebrated. And that often means that employees have the day off from work, or if they have to work, they are entitled to extra pay for working on a holiday. And so that is one of the benefits, and that happens across the country. There are some holidays that are not federal holidays, which means that like a state might celebrate it, but not the entire United States. So it might be celebrated in a particular region or area, or that it might be celebrated, but people don't have the ability to be off from work and still get paid for that work. So a federal holiday gives people the time off with pay, usually, to be able to celebrate and honor that day across the entire United States.
That's cool. And the next question is, I would like to ask if Martin Luther King has an heir or someone who continued his activity, movement, work. Thank you.
That is a fantastic question, and I don't know the answer to who that heir is. An interesting fact about his family, though, since you asked, and I'll try to find the answer and post it later to your specific question. But in talking about his family, one thing that I think is interesting is our intern told me that Martin Luther King's family owns the speech, the I Have a Dream speech. So in the United States, there are special laws where you can own things that are written, like copyright laws that protect like your creative works or your like written works. And his family still owns the speech and has the rights to it, which I think is really interesting.
No, thank you. Here is Surgab. Good afternoon. Thank you for organizing this session. And we have also the question. Martin Luther King had a lot of famous written works. So is any of them is required obligatory in American schools?
Not that I'm aware of in terms of them being required or obligatory. Most, like in my experience, a lot of teachers use his works to teach about American history. And so even if it's not like required, like across the entire United States, for some classes, it's very common and expected to teach about it and to learn about his works. So in high school in the United States, like when someone is between ages like 14 to 18 and they're going to what we call high school, right before college, students take a course called the United States History. And during that class, this time period, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s is a topic that would be covered. And his works, particularly the speech, which is considered to be very important and powerful, is something that most students would read and study in high school if they haven't already studied it before then. And then, of course, if you go on to study history in college, it's something that you would revisit and maybe study some of the other works by Martin Luther King as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we had the question, but I think you already answered. Yeah, do all states celebrate, recognize Martin Luther King Day?
They do, because it's required by the federal government, which oversees then all of the states. And so I find it still a little bit confusing, but in the United States, the federal government has the ability to create rules for all of the different states. But then the states can also create their own rules as well. And this is, the recognition of this holiday is something that is that the federal government requires of the entire country.
That's interesting. Thank you. And the next one, I have a question. How strongly did the activities of Martin Luther King unite civil society in the United States? No.
I think that's a fantastic question, Sargak. Like when we watch the speech, I think you get some sense of like how strongly his activities united people, particularly at that time, in that you're seeing, lots of different ages and people who are white and people who are Black coming together at a time, when there's a lot of discussion about people who are Black and white being forced to be separated. And his speech was really monumental in changing like the way that the United States was separating Blacks and whites in different places, like having certain restrooms for white people and certain restrooms for Black people, or telling Black people like where they had to sit in a bus. And it really like brought people together to understand that this was something that had to change. It had to change in terms of restrooms, but also like we had to do better in terms of education. And so I think really at the time it was critical in bringing people together to like around these values of civil rights and equality. And it's not a finished project or a finished work. Like we in the United States still have a lot of room to grow and improve. And it continues to be a topic today. And I think, particularly in the past couple of years, when we've been talking a lot about race and Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, I think there's really, a desire and a need to have someone like Martin Luther King who can motivate and inspire like all of us to continue on this effort to make things better, so that like all of the people in our country are treated the same and given the same opportunities. And there's a lot of work that people are doing without having a leader as famous or maybe as powerful as Martin Luther King leading the way. But I think it would be wonderful if there was like someone else who had that same ability to like really bring everybody together to unite people around a common cause.
Yeah, and I also would like to mention that I haven't known that he went to jail 29 times and still fighting and still motivate people. It's so unbelievable. Yeah, 29
Yeah.
times.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think about that and it's like you'd have to be so brave and strong to do that, right? To like believe in a cause so much that you will go to jail like over and over again to make sure that it changed. And I think that it's remarkable like how strong people are and how brave they are.
Yeah, that's. And we have also the maybe last question. Um, who monitors safety and what is the attitude of the other people?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure that I completely understand, but certainly in terms of safety, like there are lots of like groups and organizations that would be responsible for safety. So if Shermatov is wondering at like a protest or a boycott, who's in charge of safety? I think that's a really great question. Like when Martin Luther King gave his speech, I forget the numbers, but there were lots of police officers and people from the Federal Bureau of Investigations who were posted, like they were in Washington, D.C., they were outside.
Heather, are you hearing me? Oh. Так, мы, наверное, подождем, наверное, пару минут. Кажется, у Хазар есть проблемы с интернетом. И давайте мы пока чуть-чуть подождем. Oh, great! You're with us.
I think that there was like a little blip in my internet connection.
Yeah, that's okay. Today we have the snowy day, so it's expected. Yeah, and we have some more question. Let me
Okay.
show you. I would like to ask you one more question. How do you assess the role of such a personality as Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King in development of civil rights in U.S. history?
Yeah, I think incredibly important in the development of civil rights history. Both of them, maybe because I can like listen to the speeches of Martin Luther King live. For me, he's someone that like holds like more power. But I think for many people, Abraham Lincoln, as someone that they look to as really being a leader in the development of civil rights history. So both of them are incredibly important figures for the United States. And then more recently, like also President Obama and his wife, Michelle Obama, are also considered to be like really important leaders in the development of civil rights history. So I mentioned before, we continue to work on it and try to improve things. But both great role models.
And one more question. So, what is the best biography book about Martin Luther King? Some suggestion.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, this I think is a great one. Like I will look and see if I can find a good recommendation for you, and we'll see if I can drop it in to the Facebook site afterwards as a recommendation. So thank you for asking that, and I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah. So I think that it was the last question for today. So I think it was enough for you, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heather, for today, for your time, for your presentation, for your video, and also thank you, friends, for being with us, joining with us, asking your question. So have a nice evening.
Thank you. Enjoy the snow, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah. So, dear friends, bye.